It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, dig into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is J. Warner Wallace, and we're going to be talking about his new book, Person of Interest: Why Jesus Still Matters in a World That Rejects the Bible. Jim, I always look forward to talking with you. Welcome back to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. That expression about the shiny, I think you and I are alike. The shiny object thing is where I feel the same way, right?
Yeah, I get myself in trouble with some of the people I have on the show just because I read broadly. I work inside the Christian bubble, I podcast inside the Christian bubble, but I read books that kind of go different places. So sometimes the shiny objects, I get letters and questions, but hey, that makes it all fun. It's been a number of years since you were on the show. I think we last connected at an NRB 4 or 5 years ago. It's been a bit. And so I'd love to kick this off by having you once again share a bit of the J. Warner Wallace origin story for the men and women meeting you for the first time today. Give us some context. What do we need to know about you?
Well, I work cold case homicides in Los Angeles County. Did that for a number of years. I still have a couple of open cases I get to tinker with and just kind of maybe consult and give some opinions. Isn't it great to be retired and not have to worry about being responsible for these cases as much as I used to be? But that process of being a detective is what I employed as somebody who was skeptical of Scripture. I was not raised in the church, didn't grow up with the Bible in the house. We eventually attended a church. My wife wanted to church. She was kind of thought we should maybe raise our kids in some kind of a belief system. I thought, why? I mean, we have a belief system. I mean, I didn't think there was any need for it, but I was more than happy to please my wife. So I go to church, and this pastor says that Jesus is the smartest man who ever lived, and I thought that was provocative. I wasn't sure how you would even know that was true, but I bought a Bible, and he said a bunch of other things too. Don't get me wrong, but that was the thing that stuck out to the atheist. And so I bought a Bible to see what this was all about. And as I started to examine the claims of the gospel authors, I became more convinced from just an evidential perspective of how we test eyewitnesses that this was a true claim about something that happened in the past. Remember, when you work in cold cases, you're often working an eyewitness an account, but now 30 years later, that guy's dead or that gal is dead. And even sometimes the person who did the interview back then is no longer available. So now I've got a report, and I've got no access to the eyewitness or the report writer. Well, that's the Gospels. So I was just kind of leveraging what I knew and how I could assess reliability of an eyewitness against the gospel accounts. And that plus, I'm always looking at a cumulative case, right? So it's not like one thing that's ever going to pursue. Matter of fact, one witness cases are dangerous because that one witness can just be a good liar, and then now you're out of luck. So I'm always looking at the entire cumulative case. And so I was looking at Jesus. I needed to know, was there evidence outside of the Scriptures? Was there any good reason to believe, just from the fuse leading up to the explosive appearance of Jesus and the fallout that followed him, was there any good reason to believe I should trust Jesus as my Lord, as my Savior? And that's what we're doing. That second half is what we're trying to do in this next book, Person of Interest.
I think the next place I'd love to go before we get into the book is just the importance of apologetics. If I look and survey what I've seen in culture the last few years, I think it's fair to say we're fairly ignorant of history, the Bible, theology, and not just in culture. We see this a lot in the church as well. Maybe give us, for the person who says, I don't even know what apologetics is, maybe give us a little bit of context and why now, as these hard cultural conversations are happening, hard conversations are happening in church, why is having a good foundation of what is truth more important now, maybe than ever, at least in recent history?
Yeah, think about it. We are the most distracted generation it's this stupid glowing rectangle. This distracts us to the point where, think about it. When I was a kid, you had three options in terms of networks that had programming, right? And so you eventually landed. Okay, we've got these three choices. And I picked number 2. Well, now you have cable choices. I got 6,000 choices, which means I spend the entire night scrolling through choices, never land on anything. Well, that's the nature of distraction, right? And so what it comes down to is we have, for the most part, forgotten how we got here and forgotten the impact that Jesus of Nazareth has on not just Western culture, because Western culture is exported through the glowing rectangle. So it turns out this is the impact that Jesus is having on the world. And we, for the most part, are ignorant of it. We don't even know. By the way, we know a lot of other things. Like I'm in Los Angeles, right? I can tell you about the Rams. or the Chargers or the Clippers or the Lakers or the Angels or the Dodgers, or I mean, you name it. I'm just distracted by all of these other things that are vying for my attention. Well, what I wanted to do in this book, and I think it's important for all of us as Christians, okay, can we just spend as much time studying the truth about Jesus as we do studying the truth about what we're going to watch on Netflix tomorrow? Because I guarantee you, we've spent some time researching the Netflix options, yet we have no idea how to make a case for even the triune nature of God or the deity of Christ. How can we call ourselves? We're better Netflix followers than we are Christ followers right now. So it's time for us to kind of refocus.
Yeah, somehow I'm going to turn that better Netflix followers phrase into a bumper sticker, a T-shirt, some maybe a book title someday. At least a blog post. Maybe that's where that belongs. As a book guy, I'm often thinking about cover art and layout. And the one thing I've always appreciated about your many of your books, they're illustrated. You've got call outs and sidebars, and in my notes, I wrote, "Wow, this is a great immersive experience." And one of the things that is really important right now, and you held up your glowing rectangle earlier, people are totally distracted and they don't actually have the attention span often to read a page or two without having a picture or a call out or something to pause their brain. And so I feel like that's interesting to me because I know your heart is to reach as broad of an audience range as possible. So just talk to us a little bit about your heart for the illustrations, because in terms of book production, that's a lot more work to sync great artwork with what you're writing, and just maybe tell us a little bit about your process there and why that's been so important in so many of your books.
Yeah, so I have this weird background, right? So I was not going to be a cop. I wasn't interested in law. My dad was a police officer, so I knew it was a good family job. It was honorable. I always respected what my dad did, but I was interested in the arts. So I got a bachelor's degree in design, a master's degree in architecture. I'm working as an architect in Santa Monica, California, when I eventually decided to become a police officer. So for a lot of years, I was kind of frustrated with that. In other words, I felt like it was an itch I couldn't scratch, right? That creative side. But then I started working homicides, and I realized that for jurors, that there are some ways to illustrate an idea, like Jesus used word pictures or parables. Well, we could do something similar for juries. And it's not a matter of just making the words visual. It's about using visuals instead of words. And that process of doing closing arguments and opening statements visually informs my own thinking about how I write a book. So, for example, in a book like this, there's going to be I spent 2 years researching this book. Okay, and so there's a lot of data. But I know when I get ready to write a book, I'm not just going to dump all this data on you. It's in the footnotes. There's 279-page PDF file online, in addition to the 50 pages that are in the book. But I know that's not really, I need to make a persuasive closing argument. And if I'm going to make a persuasive closing argument from all that data, there's a point at which, if you just see it, like, for example, I talk about one part of the book where it's about that window of opportunity where Jesus appears in history. Well, I need to show you the overlapping fuses that get us there. And then you see it and you go, oh, yeah, you don't even need to say anything. I get it. I can see it. That's the kind of thing I'm after in a book. And that's hard writing a book because books are about words. So I want to do both. It's kind of like a graphic novel in the sense that it throws quickly, it reads quickly. That's what I'm looking for. Now, here's my fear, John. I'll just tell you this is my fear. My fear is that we're making it worse. In other words, by not requiring people to step away from this highly visual, distracted, every turn a page, turn an idea, kind of quick, 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 quick. Like, do we have any stomach anymore to take things deeply? But at the same time, I'm not writing an academic book. I want a book that you can give to your high schooler, that you can read yourself, that it will reach everyone from 18 to 8 or from 15 to 80. I want to reach that broader audience. And what we're trying to do as apologists, as Christian casemakers, is we're trying to translate heavier concepts. So there's always going to be a book out there that has some of the content that's in my book that is going to be academic. And my fear is that no one's reading those books except for those of us who are translating. So how do we get those concepts to people who are distracted? So at least they're interested enough to maybe look in the footnotes and go, where did you get that from? Oh, there's a book out there. Let's go see what's in that book. There's a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Bauckham, who I referenced in my first book, Cold Case Christianity. My fear is that no one's reading that other book. I want to introduce you to the experts. And that's what these kinds of books do.
Well, in terms of people being distracted, I think to some degree we have to almost retrain our brain to dig deeply. I'm working through Eugene Peterson's classic title, "Eat This Book," which really it looks at spiritual reading and going deep and thinking about it, especially for something like the Bible, why it's not just a flippant reading. And if we're going to get back into that as a practice, whether it's with the Bible or with other books, we're going to have to challenge ourselves to shut the phone off, get away. And at first, we'll be really distracted. But I think it's a worthy pursuit, especially as somebody like Jim is introducing us to other resources that can help you go deeper beyond what he's just giving you a sample of in his book. So that'd be my challenge. If something in this interview sparks you to want to pick up another book, get a quiet place and read it. I don't think you'll regret that. I want to pull a little bit more on kind of the fuse and fallout investigation strategy. You've referenced that a few times. Just give a little bit more context for that and how it relates to how the book plays out, if you will.
Well, we just talked about how to make a visual, sometimes a visual strategy. It sets a framework that then everything else kind of falls into place. And that's why I use a fuse and a fallout. I do this on no body murders. Now, I've had a number of these where someone kills their business partner, someone kills their wife, someone kills their husband, and then they'll claim that, "Oh, I don't know what happened to her. We had an argument last night and she drove off, but she just never came back." Oh, really? Okay. So, yeah. And as a matter of fact, I'm just going to take a missing persons report. So now no one initially is working this. I've had cases, for example, where the husband will come into the station. So now it's like a day after she's no longer shows up. So he goes missing on a Tuesday. He's in the office on a Wednesday filing a report, which gets assigned to a detective by Friday. We're already 4 days behind this. Okay. And then it's a Friday, so he doesn't get to it. So Monday he makes the phone call. Did she return? Thinking, oh, she'll return. I mean, she's just the way she's had an argument. No, she never returned. So now you're 4 plus the 2 weekend days. You're 6 days behind this thing. So what happens is you end up with no crime scene effort because number one, it's not even taken as a homicide. No one's taking pictures of the house. No one's even investigating as a murder. I had one case for 30 years. This guy who killed his wife had convinced her family that she had just run off. They never once called our agency to ask, "Are you working my daughter's murder?" They never thought it was a murder. Well, you get away with that for 30 years. Now you've got no evidence in your crime scene. How do you make a case like that in front of a jury? I've got no body. I've got no evidence from a crime scene. Well, you always say, look, up on the day she went missing, she was killed by her husband. That's an explosive event. But all bombs are preceded by a fuse that burns slowly up to that detonation. And once that explodes, you've got shrapnel all over the blast radius. We're going to demonstrate to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what happened on the day she went missing from simply showing you what's in the fuse and what's in the fallout. It's his behavior before, his behavior afterward, all the tension that's growing before, all of his suspicious behavior afterwards. We're going to demonstrate what happened on that day. Well, I thought about this. If you look at it from a perspective of the skeptic who's not willing to imagine a scenario in which every New Testament manuscript had been utterly destroyed, some future dystopian evil regime, it just destroys every Bible. Well, it turns out that there's a fuse that led up to the explosive appearance of Jesus. And there's a fallout that occurs in history afterwards. If you didn't have a New Testament, you could still reconstruct the story of Jesus from the fuse and the fallout the same way we reconstruct the story of that day from the fuse and the fallout of a crime. That's the approach we're taking with this book. We're going to make a case for Jesus as if every New Testament had been destroyed. And it turns out we'll be able to reconstruct every detail, especially of what matters, so that you could actually, if you were somebody 1,000 years from now and there were no Bibles available, you could still, I believe, come to a saving faith in the Savior of the world from just the information you glean from history. That's the kind of impact that Jesus had.
Well, and for this next part of the interview, I just want to cherry pick a couple of the chapter themes that were particularly
Sure.
interesting to me. What I always appreciate about all of your books is you take on topics that people are going to encounter when they're searching on YouTube or searching on the web for spiritual topics. You're going to find all kinds of things that are pro Jesus, pro the Bible, and the complete opposite direction. Talk to us a little bit about Jesus, the copycat savior. Was Jesus copying a bunch of, well, if Jesus was made up and we just copycatted a bunch of other mythological figures, does he fit into that same space, or is he something completely different?
Yeah, I think this is what I used to hear all the time. There's a movie called Zeitgeist, or another movie called The God Who Wasn't There, I think it's called. And these are claims that, all Jesus is another cobbled together mythology, like all the other dying and rising saviors that preceded him. And they'll try to draw parallels between the details of Jesus's life and the details of some of ancient mythology. Now, it turns out if you do your homework, you'll see that there's not much similarity between Jesus and any mythology, but there are overarching broad parallels. So, for example, most ancient myths, the people who believe in these myths believe that mythological deity uh, came into the world in an unnatural way. Sometimes it's now, so did Jesus, right? But did he come like Jesus? No. The differences are very, very broad. Like Mithras comes out of the side of a mountain, leaving a gaping cave or a hole in the mountain. Some deities are born out of the thigh of a prior deity. I mean, you get all kinds of weirdness, right? But again, the general expectation that if there is a God, he might come into the world in an unexpected, unnatural way, that seems like a reasonable expectation on the part of an ancient, even on the part of a contemporary. So it turns out that these similarities that I see, and I went back and studied all the mythologies and I found 15 common characteristics of mythologies, and they are very broad. But you do see now, look, none of these mythologies have more than about 10, and they're always a different 10. And some of them have as few as six until we get to a historical figure named Jesus of Nazareth, who happens to embody all 15 of the attributes most robustly. Isn't that interesting? Why now? It's as though it's if you're trying to meet the expectations of people who are thinking about God, Jesus meets all of those expectations. It's as if Paul is talking about this on Mars Hill. You people are very religious, and I see that you're very religious. You've even got a monument to an unknown God here, but I'm here to tell you there's a real God who actually meets these expectations you all had. Because poets think about these things. He even cites a poem from the ancients, right? Poets think about these things, but it turns out God will meet your expectations because wouldn't you be surprised that humans designed in the image of God might have expectations and think about God? Yet Jesus meets those expectations more robustly than any single mythology. And here's what's interesting. If you're suggesting that the ancient Jewish writers of the Gospels were trying to convince Jews that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, by cobbling together non-Jewish gods into that one thing that Jews have been warned against their entire existence. That to me this makes no sense at all. And instead, what you have are just the expectations of all of us that come and are personified in Jesus. As a matter of fact, if you wanted to show up when those ancient mythologies are the most robustly being worshipped simultaneously, that gives you a window because this doesn't happen much into the common era. The ancient Osiris worship, for example, begins to wane. If you want to catch it, if you want to show up when the ancients are thinking about these things, there's a window in which you show up. That's one of the windows in which Jesus shows up right in the middle. So he actually leverages the expectations of humans because he is God. Remember, when the expected meets, when the expected meets the expectations of the expector, you get a great response. And this is why I think part of the reason why Jesus worship explodes in the first century, because it meets the expectations of the ancients.
Well, and I want to pull on one thread quick in terms of knowing a little bit ancient Near Eastern context. In terms of what we understand, we often will try to project our modern thoughts and what should be normal back on ancient people in terms of, especially with wrestling with these sorts of topics. And so,
Yeah,
just being able to know that the Jews would have been opposed to somebody trying to cobble together
sure.
this reasoning. That's definitely a helpful perspective. Next, I'd love to have you speak into the divine timing of Jesus' arrival. We often say that Jesus came in the fullness of time. Was there something special or unique about when Jesus makes an appearance?
Yeah, if you take that whole window that opens up based on trying to, if you want to show up when the most number of ancient worshipers with these common 15 expectations are still on planet Earth worshiping their myths, there's a window. It's a pretty broad window, several hundred years. But if you overlap on that, a window called the Pax Romana, this is the cultural fuse that's burning. It turns out that it's not until the Roman Empire emerges that they dominate the world in a way that no other prior empire, be it Greek or Egyptian or Persian, dominates the world. And that empire basically puts an end for about 200 years to the kinds of wars that were typically being waged between every other people group. So that Pax Romana of 200 years is a time when you can now leverage your resources to build roads and tunnels and bridges to secure your postal service system, They actually had also now adopted the Etruscan alphabet using papyrus, using a common Greek language. All of these communication necessities were in place during the Pax Romana so that Paul could actually travel on roads that weren't available several hundred years earlier, but now were available to him so that once Jesus lands, the message of Jesus could travel. And that is another smaller window. When you overlap that over the spiritual window, you get a much smaller window of opportunity. Then, when you overlap, this is why this is a visual book. You need to kind of see the overlaps. But then, when you overlap the prophetic views of the ancient Jews, especially the prophecy of Daniel, that says that the Messiah will come between the restoration of Jerusalem under edict and the destruction of the temple. Well, now you end up with the smallest window you can possibly imagine, which runs from about 30 BC to about 70 AD. And it turns out that you can just tell something's going to happen in that window. And then Jesus arrives right in the middle of it. And so this is the fullness of time in which God orchestrates history in such a way that the fuse is designed to burn and open up this window that when he arrives on planet Earth, something amazing is going to happen and unprecedented is going to happen. And that's what you see in that small window. It's not that I worked backwards from Jesus. I remember doing this 20 years ago when I was looking at the case for Christianity for the first time and just being blown away by that small window and thinking, how could anyone who, but I guess a lot of it is number one, not everyone is doing what we're doing. And also, number two, that a lot of us have reasons to reject truth that are not evidential at all. They're about our desires and our history and our personal wants and likes and dislikes. And so, a lot of reasons why we would ignore this kind of evidence. But when you see it and you see the window visually, you're going to think to yourself, how can anyone not know that Jesus is who he said he was?
One of the things we hear often today is that it doesn't matter what religion you follow, they all lead to the same place. Why is Jesus the one and only path, if you will?
Well, isn't it interesting that if you look at all the history of belief systems, especially surrounding deity, you can put them on a timeline. And Jesus is going to arrive, right when he arrives. Now, of course, there are systems of belief that follow Jesus, like, Islam, Ahmadi Islam. You look at Baha'i. There's lots of systems that follow Jesus. And of course, not surprisingly, every one of those systems mentions Jesus in some way. Jesus' name is on the pages of the Quran. Jesus' name is on the pages of the holy writings of Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith. But what's interesting is there's a bunch of systems that precede Jesus. And it turns out they all mention Jesus too. How can that be? Because once they emerge, they continue in history into the Common Era, they end up either merging, modifying, or mentioning Jesus. The leaders of Buddhism have kind things to say about Jesus. They see him as an enlightened teacher in the tradition of Buddhism. Same is true for Hinduism. It turns out that the people who are still worshiping, who preceded Jesus, also hat tipped Jesus. So Jesus can be found, he's a prophet of even greater stature than Muhammad. He is a manifestation of God like Baha'u'llah and all the others, according to Baha'i. Jesus is on the pages and on the lips, on the tongue of leaders in every other group. Yet Jesus will tell you, no. He was aware that Buddhism precedes him. Hinduism precedes him. All those mythologies preceded him. Yet he would say that I am the truth, the way, the truth, the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. So while every other world religion hat tips Jesus, Jesus doesn't return the favor. And as a matter of fact, now, why would that surprise you? Look, if I told you that I live on this street, but any direction you use in Waze or any direction you use on your map service will get you to my house, you're going to end up in a lot of places you shouldn't be. It turns out there's only one set of directions that'll get you to my house. But why would it be surprised to find there's only one set of directions that gets you to the Father's house? So there's a sense in which, well, which one is it? But by the way, all these systems say contradictory things about the nature of God, the nature of salvation, even the nature of our origins, the entire worldviews these represent. So why would we want to think that Jesus? Well, isn't it interesting that everyone else has something to say about Jesus that's positive, yet Jesus has nothing? Imagine I had a case once where I had, I think, 7 or 8 suspects for this murder of a woman, and I had to go through all of them to figure out who's the one guy. And it turns out the one suspect usually ends up having some unique features, the unique relationship that caused him to be this angry, the unique opportunity to get into the house when nobody else could get in, the unique window in which he could operate, unique. And he separates himself from the other 7. Well, it turns out that Jesus says something very similar. He's mentioned by everybody else, but he separates himself. And number two, he offers a way that is utterly different than every other way. Every other worldview will say it's something you have to do to be united to a holy God, where Jesus says there's nothing you could do. It's something that I have to do for you. That's such a unique worldview that he always stands out as the one unique suspect in a catalog of suspects. And that's why I eventually said, okay, that case, the case of all the impact that he's had, even the fact that you could reconstruct broadly the story of Jesus from the non Christian religions who hat tip him, tells me that if you're going to be on a spiritual search, you should just start with Jesus. Because Jesus, it turns out, is mentioned by everybody else. So you might as well start there.
And Jim, in terms of the reader's journey with the book, obviously, on the one hand, they're going to get to the end of the book and see that you've made a solid case for Jesus. But in terms of processing, wrestling with other things that they may encounter, maybe things that are outside of the scope of what you cover in this book, how do you hope you've helped them to think differently or process differently along the way of this journey?
Well, here's how I look at it. I mean, I think that the impact that Jesus has had on history and the fact that his story can be recovered. So, for example, the writings of all the science fathers, they write about Jesus. Believe it or not, science fathers are dominantly Christ followers, science fathers. So you can actually reconstruct more about the story of Jesus from the science fathers than you can from the church fathers. Here's my point. In the end, I think if you could look, I've heard it said, well, can't a fictional character have impact on culture? Well, sure. I mean, there are fictional characters like Pinocchio. We all know who Pinocchio is. We all know who Peter Pan is. Really, do we order our calendar around that? Has he been the most written about character in all of history? Has he had more impact on music and arts than any other historical figure? Has he had more? Is he responsible for modern education as we know it? Are more science fathers followers of Peter Pan? No. It turns out there's no other fictional character who's had anywhere near the impact of Jesus. So there's good reason to believe that Jesus is not a fictional character if you cannot find me a parallel. Also, there's no other mortal human who's had this kind of impact on history. So there's probably good reason that that Jesus is more than a mortal human. In other words, this kind of impact actually makes a case for the historicity and deity of Jesus, along with the writings of the New Testament. I would never suggest you separate those two. The case is robust. It's both inside the New Testament and outside the New Testament. And I get it. If you're listening to us right now, you probably have I have open questions about God, the nature of God, the role of my sovereign, but do I have free will? Is God sovereign over everything I even think? I don't even know how to parse that out. What about end times? I don't know how do I read Genesis 1? I mean, there's lots of things that we as Christians will wrestle with. But we always tell jurors, look, I cannot answer every question for you. I've never been able to do that for a jury. You'll have to make a choice and render a verdict, even though you have some unanswered questions. Now, I'm going to get you to a place where you're beyond a reasonable doubt. I'm not going to get you beyond a possible doubt. That's not a reasonable standard. But I'm going to get you beyond a reasonable doubt. And even though you have open questions, how did he kill her that day? Don't know. He never confessed. Where did he get rid of the body? Don't know. How did he move her car? Don't know. How did he do this in the house while their kids were in the next room? Don't know. But I know that he did it, even though I don't understand how he did it. Now, we have to make sure we know that there's a reasonable limit. We tend to have a tendency to raise the bar on religious, spiritual things because we really don't want to bend our knee. That's what it comes down to. A lot of it is you would never have the bar this high in even picking the next car you're going to buy, the next home you're going to buy, even the spouse you married. Yet you have the highest possible standard here because why? This makes the highest demand on what we are, who we are as humans. So let's just be honest about what it is that's stopping us. Often it's not, we're looking for an excuse, not necessarily a proper justification. So let's make sure we're not looking for excuses.
And Person of Interest is just one of many wonderful books that Jim has written. For those who'd like to connect with you, find out more about your many, you got other books, courses, all the things. Where do we discover you on the web?
Just at coldcasechristianity.com, coldcasechristianity.com. You'll see links there for everything else.
And like we do with every episode, we'll make it easy. We'll have links in the show notes or the description with links to Jim's website, links to where you can buy this book. And sadly, it's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. I always enjoy every time that Jim and I get to talk. Our book today, once again, was Person of Interest, Why Jesus Still Matters in a World That Rejects the Bible. And Jim, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you back in the show.
As you know, all your priorities. Anytime you want to talk, let's just reach out to me. We'll do it again.